Okay, thanks folks. Today I'll be talking about a new product from Geoscience Australia called Water Observations from Space and some of the projects that we've used this data set on. I'll first off tell you a little bit about what WOfS is and compare that to the typical Landsat workflow that we would normally employ before WOfS came along, and then give you a couple of examples of the applications that we've used them on, and a couple of reflections on how we might be able to move forward. So the Water Observation from Space dataset is a product of the Data Cube at the National Computing Infrastructure, which is located at the Australian National University, and it was developed by Geoscience Australia. And what it does is it uses the Landsat archive to map inundation for each Landsat image available across Australia. The WOfS dataset itself is basically an aggregation of all of that data to be able to provide a pixel by pixel account of frequency of inundation, and it's expressed as a percentage of clear observations. So cloud cover, terrain shadow, all that is masked out, and it gives you just a percent of clear observations, whether it was inundated or not. It uses Landsat 5 and 7. Landsat 8 has just been brought online to be able that was incorporated into the full data set. Uses Landsat's 25 megapixels and is a nationally consistent data set going from 1987 through to the present. It's served as a web mapping service that you can access, so you don't have to download the whole data set. You can use it as a data set that basically plugs into ArcGIS or whatever GIS you might be using. Underlying the WOfS dataset is what's known as the water observation feature layers, and that's each Landsat image that's been classified into I guess three main classes that you're really interested in is water in the pixel, whether there's a valid observation of no water, or basically the rest of them, which is no useful data. The beautiful thing about this dataset is that it's all of the data raw. You get to define the temporal aggregation. You can do it monthly, annually, within decades, or whatever it is that you might be interested in. That's not available in the WOfS dataset, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit later. So compare that to what you would normally do with Landsat. You have a project that you want to map inundation on. You would have to locate the tiles from the USGS website, filter it for cloud cover, submit a request to USGS, wait for them to pull it from the archive, download the data, unzip it and split it into different satellites because you have different parameters to be able to convert it to top of atmosphere. If you're using Landsat 7, then you have to mask out the no data from the scanline correction issues starting in 2003 before you even get a chance to be able to start mapping inundation, mosaicing it, putting it together and analysing the data. You don't have to do that anymore because it's all been done by Geoscience Australia, which is fantastic. I was going to talk about this project, but I'll skip through it because we might run out of time.
You're early, so you're
I'm early? Okay, why not? Okay, so this is a project that I ran for the Goyder Institute in the Lake Eyre Basin. The waterholes in the Neils Peak catchment basically distributed across the whole of the catchment. They're connected by irregular floods, and basically when there's no flooding, they start to contract and get disconnected progressively more as the waterholes shrink and shrink. The pattern of the waterhole persistence has the capacity to be able to shape fish population structure, but unfortunately there's not really much data to be able to I guess, provide any useful information as to how these waterholes and the fish populations interact. We need this information to be able to develop conceptual models, understand the baseline function, and whether they might be going beyond thresholds of potential concern through to due to either land management practices or mining or climate change. Here's the study area. There's about 60 odd waterholes that have been mapped by SARDI. And they tend to get monitored at sort of irregular intervals. So the problem that we were asked to deal with was to be able to map inundation status of these waterholes at the end of dry periods to be able to see how they function, whether there are specific waterholes that persist for end of dry periods, or whether, depending on what the the drying dynamic was, whether different water holes stay inundated at some end of dry periods, whereas others might actually come online for a different period. We used these 4 dry periods: 99, 2002, 2005, and 2008. I won't talk about that bit, but basically what we did was to pull a 2-month window before a rain event, as much WOfS data there was, so this is the underlying data, to be able to see if there was a valid inundation that was detected. If not, whether there was a valid not inundated status there, and if not, then there was no data. So basically it's a flat layer for each of these 4 dates that says whether there was an inundated pixel or not. The output, and after I did that, used this map over here to be able to see if there was an inundated pixel near each of these points, giving an output that shows you, the name of each of the water holes, the 4 dates, and if there's a blue cell, that means that it was inundated. A pink cell says that it was not inundated, and no valid observations, these grey cells over here. What's interesting is that there are a couple of water holes. Actually, this is the same water hole, but it's a large water hole and different locations along it. That one stayed wet across all 4 dry periods, and there's a couple of dams out there as well that stayed wet throughout the whole period. And I guess the interesting thing is that although there are a number of water holes that didn't show any inundation whatsoever, there are some that show that during 2002 it was wet, but in 2005 it wasn't, whereas there are a couple of other water holes that were wet in 2005 but wet in 2002, suggesting that there is a slightly dynamic distribution of water holes that stay wet during some periods or dry during others. This has an effect on how you would actually develop the conceptual models of fish populations and where they find refuge. Here's a cool little map that I made showing Algebacana, which is one of the main water holes over there, and you can see, so these colours represent these different dates, and Algebacana midstream and east basically were down to 1 pixel of inundation for this rather dry period in 1999, whereas 2002 basically started connecting these areas up again, even at the end of a dry period. It'd be really good to, so there's a problem with this where if the pixel goes to less than 25 metres, then you probably won't be detecting it, and that's an issue. A better application of this data set would be to actually look at the wet events and to see how those dynamics change over different types of wet periods. Here's another project that we used the data set on. This is what Dorothy did, which is sitting just over there. It was for a Gordon Institute project as well, looking at the southeast wetlands. Now, the thing is that there's a South Australian Wetland Inventory dataset that has 17,000 wetlands catalogued in there, but only 1/3 of them are classified according to their inundation regime. And you need that as one of the inputs into a habitat classification model that uses these breaks in the dataset to be able to say whether it was a seasonal, ephemeral, permanent, and what type of habitat it provides. There's not really a huge amount of information on the inundation extents and the dynamics, but there's also less on salinity, and these are 2 very important inputs that you need for it. Prior to WOfS, you wouldn't run any analysis on this. It would be too arduous to be able to go through all of the Landsat archive to be able to come up with a solution for this, but WOfS basically gave a very quick and dirty solution that came up with some really interesting results that kind of give more of an idea of the dynamic nature of these habitats instead of just using that rather simplistic approach. It was done for the whole of the southeastern wetlands, but I'll show you just what happened in Lake Horden South. So that's your Sayward extent over there, and basically all of that extent is provided with one value, and it's called semi-permanent. Using WOfS though, you can start getting an idea of the actual inundation dynamics within that whole of that lake. Blue over here is high frequency of inundation, and brown is low. And it shows that basically, Lake Horden is a series of relatively disconnected pools that are frequently inundated most of the time, but it gets reconnected in low-frequency flood events. This would be great to be able to start giving information as to how the rest of the two-thirds of the wetlands might function, and give us a bit more of a complex understanding of the dynamics within these wetlands, and maybe even start to provide an input into modelling scenarios that might assess their sensitivity to climate change and potential management actions. This is another project we did for the Goyder Institute in the Lake Eyre Basin. This is one that I did looking at the distinct populations of the golden perch in the Lake Eyre Basin in conjunction with the University of, Flinders University. So there's a bunch of fish data that's been caught over the years by SARDI, and Flinders University have genetically sequenced these fish, and they've come up with an understanding of the population dynamics and which fish or which locations they've caught fish in that are related to one another. And they want to know why some are related to some populations and why they're different to others. There's not really a huge amount of data over there, so looking back in time hasn't been realistic in the past. But we gave it a crack. So these are the locations of where the fish have been caught. And the colours over here basically suggest that fish in the Cooper Creek catchment are of distinct population compared to the fish found in Diamantina and Georgina and in Lake Frome. Now, the question is, these guys are closer to one another. How is it that they're very much different to one another, even though this fella over here has a population of fish that are basically cousins to this population over here? What I did was use the WOfS dataset to basically run a least cost path algorithm that goes where it searches for the most efficient path for fish from location 1 to swim out to these 3 locations, bearing in mind that these guys are cousins and these guys aren't. What it does is basically says that if there's high frequency inundation, it would choose that cell to be able to move through, to be able to get to the next cell, trying to get itself to these different destinations. And these are the paths that basically came out of that analysis. It points that even though there's a point over here where there's low frequency of inundation, so there's a high chance of disconnection, that's shared by these 3 populations. But over here, in this location over here, there's actually what might be potentially a blockage for allowing fish to be able to flow from here all the way up here, compared to the relatively easy path they have to these 2 locations. Another thing about this data set is it points to these choke points and where they might be sensitive to changes in inundation regime, depending on whether it's land management or climate change. Whereas this location over here is quite obviously an area of high frequency of inundation, and they might be very important regions of providing refuge for these for the golden perch. It would be really good to be able to run this analysis in different temporal aggregations to be able to figure out what type of inundation event does allow for connection between these populations. That's a work in progress. This is a project that was done by one of our undergraduate students in one of her end of degree projects. She didn't have any experience in GIS or remote sensing. I'll skip through the reasons why the Coorong is important. Basically, what she did was aggregate the Coorong into these 7 zones and look at the inundation dynamics for these guys on an annual scale and compared them to basically, I'll talk about the stuff that she did with monthly rainfall or annual rainfall. Got inundation frequency for each year going from 1998 through to 2013 to be able to give an understanding of how inundation changed for each of these zones. Now these colours over here match up with the colours over here in the graph. You've got your year. This index is basically a unitless index that accounts for the differences in area within each of these zones, so they're all commensurate. You can see that the first two lagoons, north and south, are fed pretty much from the ocean and the barrages, and they're quite invariant, although it'd be nice if someone can tell us what happened in 1997 to cause that huge dip. These zones over here are much more variant, and it's mainly due to the fact that this green zone over here is basically the point of disconnection between these lagoons and these guys over here. This is another way of being able to show the variability of those zones, and apparently there's a stronger relationship for these guys between rainfall and frequency of inundation, which doesn't exist for these zones up here. It's a great scale to be able to use this data set. It's something that might be a little bit sensitive to cloud cover issues, but I think the fact that we could repurpose a couple of scripts from previous projects to be able to let someone who has very little knowledge of GIS and remote sensing shows that this data set has a lot of potential for a lot of people to be able to use it. So, I think one of the important things about this data set is that it provides a nationally consistent product that people can access and not have to worry too much about talking about the pros and cons about using this data set. There's a vocab that's associated with it that people can share scripts to be able to process this information that makes it something that I look forward to being able to continue to use, and hopefully there's more work done in the space. I'd like to thank the people who helped us very much with this data, which was Norman Muller and Alexis McIntyre at Geoscience Australia, and gave us the raw WOfS data. God Institute and these folk over here. So thanks.